Good evening, and thank you for joining us. As you can tell, this is not Andrea Solopka. Andrea isn't able to be with us this evening, so I'm filling in, hopefully, as well as she does. Tonight, our guest, well, let me just say a couple of things first. We've had some difficulties in the past with getting our sound correct, and we're working on that. Just keep in mind, all of us are volunteers, and we're doing the best we can, and we're learning on the job. Our guests this evening are Kay and Don Steele, and you're not going to hear a lot from me because they have a great story to tell you. So at this point in time, I will turn the program over to them and let them share with you things that have occurred in their life and what they think you may be interested in hearing.
What we hope they'll be interested in.
Oh, they will be. Is your mic on? Hold it up close.
I am.
There you go.
Okay. I'm Kay. You can tell that. I grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia. I'm an only child. And my dad grew up in the country. He loved country life. And therefore, when we lived in Portsmouth, even though we were technically in the city, we had goats and chickens and rabbits and ducks until we got, well, actually we were in the county at first. Then we got annexed into the city. So we had all those things, and we also had a garden back behind the house. A funny story about my daddy, he loved fried chicken. And my mother did everything she could to please him. And so one day she said to me, you know, Daddy's birthday is today. We're going to go out in the chicken yard and we're going to get a chicken. And we're going to fix fried chicken. And so we did. We walked out in the chicken yard and picked out the chicken that we thought would be good. And then
It's okay.
Oops.
Sorry.
It's all right. Went out in the chicken, got the chicken yard, and got the chicken and brought it back to the back of the house. And then it came time to chop the chicken's head off. Mother had never done that before, and neither had I. And so I was to hold the chicken, and Mama was going to take a hatchet and chop off its head. I can still remember the feel of that wind coming past my hand as that hatchet came down. It did not feel very comfortable. And as soon as she hit the chicken and the head fell off, that chicken started fluttering. And I let go of that chicken. Well, right behind our house was a creek, and that chicken started towards the creek. That wasn't a good thing. No chicken for supper. But Mother got a bushel basket. I say we had a garden, so we had bushel baskets sitting everywhere. She got the bushel basket, put it over the chicken, stopped the chicken from going in the creek. And my daddy had a birthday present that night, a fried chicken supper. And we were so tickled with that. I was probably 11 or 12 years old when that happened.
I grew up in Lancaster, South Carolina, a small mill town in the northern part of the state, or upstate, as the South Carolinians say. I was the second of 5 children. My father worked for a fuel oil delivery business. My mother kept house and looked after us children. I was what you would call, I think, an average student in an average school system. And once when I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, I heard one teacher say to another that Don is not near as sharp as his older brother, Jerry, who I had in class last year. Well, and he was smart as a whip. Well, I knew then that I was going to have to work extra hard if I was going to ever show them that I knew something. We did not have any fancy toys growing up. We made toys and made up games to work in the yard. Our house was more or less a gathering place for the neighborhood children. I was never sure why that was the case, but kids used to love to come there and play, and we played with them, and always had a good time. And my parents often invited foster children to come and stay at our house for a few months. And at first, we were sort of resented all the attention that they got because my parents looked after them carefully, and the neighbors were always interested in who they were. So, but we came to like them, and it was rather fun having them around.
My parents grew up during the Depression, and it had consequences for them. Maybe some of you had consequences in your life too because of the Depression and your parents' experience with that. Mother dropped out of school in the 3rd grade, and Dad just never wanted to owe anybody any money for anything. So when Daddy would get paid, he would bring home his paycheck, and they would get out the mason jars. I've heard other people say they did this too. And each one was labeled by rent, electricity, whatever, and they would divide the money out that way. And Mother was the one who kept track of all of that. Well, their dream was to own a house. We were renting it at the time, but they didn't want to go into debt. And my daddy had to have cash on hand before he would do anything. It took 5 years to build the first part of our house, 1 bedroom, a bath, and a kitchen. Many friends came to help my dad, but they couldn't do it until Daddy saved money. He saved money for the foundation of the house, and then came the friends. He saved money for the framing of the house, and then came the friends. He saved money for the wiring of the house, and then my uncles, who were electricians, came and did that work. And that's the way the house was built, piece by piece by piece. When we moved, we didn't have a hot water heater. Well, our plumber friend found an old tank, and he took that tank and we put it on stilts in the back of the house, and then we put a shower curtain around it, and that was our shower. So in the summertime, you fill the tank up with water, let the heat of the sun heat it all up, and then you had a wonderful shower at the end of the day. Well, Daddy said, no problem. By next summer, we'll have a hot water heater. Well, that wasn't the case. The next summer, we had to go down to the creek where Daddy had knew that tank at the end of the first summer, get the tank out of the creek, bring it back up, and do it all over again. And we did that for 3 or 4 years. I can't remember now how long, but it was a long time. It was not the best thing in the world. And of course, when winter came, we had to heat the water on top of the stove. But we did. It was not a problem. So after 5 years, we added a bedroom and a living room. So it was a slow-go house, and a lot of friends really helped out. And then Daddy, in turn, would go and help others in their house later.
Our house was on the edge of town, almost out in the country. And it was a big lot, big enough for it to have a pasture out back. So Dad decided that we would have a cow, and he went somewhere and bought a cow. Her name was Tish, and always a good cow. Kept us plenty supplied with milk and butter, and even enough to share with the neighbors. My brother, who was a year older, learned how to milk the cow. I learned how to make butter. My dad grew up on a cotton farm and was sure that he never again wanted to raise cotton. So he always had a vegetable patch in the backyard. Tomatoes, though, were his favorite thing. I think he always had tomatoes if he had nothing else. And I remember the last years of his life. In fact, the year that he died, he had a tomato patch that summer, and he lived to be 89. He was often frustrated, though, because his sons did not share his love for gardening. It was hard work for us, but he just loved it. Of course, Dad's love for gardening meant that Mother was always canning food, vegetables. And we children were shelling and shucking and complaining about shelling and shucking. But we really did enjoy those vegetables, especially in the middle of the winter. If you had green beans, snap beans, you were in high cotton. Mom was a good cook, always loaded the table with food, biscuits almost every meal, and she made the best biscuits. Never had a recipe written down that we could ever find. All of us watched her make her biscuits and tried to do it ourselves, but none of us had any success. And she thought all that of us children should know how to cook. And so she set out teaching each one of us. She started me by teaching me how to make cakes and muffins and that sort of thing. And I learned it well, but I never got beyond that. I can still make desserts, but that's about it. It was not unusual for cousins and other neighborhood children to show up at our house at dinner time. Apparently, they liked her food too, and they would show up and be invited to eat, and most always did.
I enjoyed her cooking too. That was a great thing when I met Don, and also found out that he had taught her how to cook, because I didn't know how to cook when we first were together. But anyway, as I said, my dad loved the country. So we had that garden I mentioned earlier. First it was behind the house, and then we had two lots even back further behind the house. And later on, we had lots all around the neighborhood. We probably have 4 or 5 lots in the neighborhood that Daddy would work on. So each season, we had a friend that would go and plow those lots up. And then after that, Daddy would use a push plow. I can still see him doing that, walking down the street with his push plow and plowing up those fields. He later did get a tractor that he could walk behind, and that was a big, big deal. But he saved every bit of money until he could pay cash for it, and we finally got that tractor. In the summertime, Dad would get up early in the morning before light and be out in the field before the light finally finished coming up. And Mother would go fix his breakfast. He would come in after breakfast, eat, and go to work. He was an automobile mechanic. He worked on batteries and ignition services. And then, as soon as he came home, Mother would have supper on the table. So the garden was a big part of our life. Mother and I did most of the harvesting. We all shelled butter beans and snap beans and dug potatoes. One year, my dad really got enthusiastic about the garden, about potatoes in particular. You know how big our area is out here for the farm to table, plus what the residents here have? That's a pretty big lot. We had a lot half that size that we planted potatoes in one year. It was a mess. On Saturdays, we would work on that lot, and my dad got us all out there harvesting one day, and then finally it almost killed us, and Daddy said, never, ever again will we do that. And we all agreed with him. It was hard work. On Saturdays, in the summer, I would take my little wagon. I had a little red wagon. Most kids had one. And I would take butter beans and corn and all kinds of things from the garden around to some apartments that were very near us and sell them. And then my daddy also would take food to the local stores for them, and we raised flowers, asters and chrysanthemums and things like that, and Daddy would take those to the florist. So it was a big, big deal for us. Gardening, he just loved it, and it made a lot of good times for us all those years. And Mother, just like Don's mother, ended up canning everything he got out of there at first. Finally, we got enough money together to get a freezer, and she started freezing things.
In Lancaster, the cotton mill offered about the only work for high school graduates. and some who did not graduate were able to get on. And these young folks looked forward to that big paycheck that they got every Friday. Their parents and their grandparents complained about breathing problems and long hours of back-breaking work. Of course, our parents had greater dreams for us, a college education. My older brother, who could have done well in college, had no need of that, and so as soon as he graduated, he got a job at the cotton mill, bought his first car, a second-hand blue two-door 1950 Ford. Boy, was he proud of that car. Gas in those days was 26 cents a gallon, I guess, or maybe even as low as 20. And so 50 cents worth of gas would go a long way. His not going to college made it seem all the more important for me to go to college, since I was second in line. We were Baptists, and because my mother's father had been a Baptist minister, she and other members of the family seemed to expect that I would follow in his footsteps. But engineering sounded much more exciting to me. And my dad was partly responsible for that because he let me help him with every repair job he had around the house. Now, he was not one to call a repairman until he worked on it and got it fixed or could not fix it. And I got to help on those things. Because he delivered fuel oil, he often worked on his customers' floor furnaces and heaters, and he would let me go along. And I remember many times going out in the cold on a winter night, crawling under somebody's house to work on the floor furnace. It was cold and dirty work, but I always learned something. So after high school, I enrolled in a 2-year college in western North Carolina that was operated by the Baptists. And I think my mother hoped that in those 2 years, I would give up on engineering and become a preacher. But I was determined not to do that. And after finishing there, I entered Clemson A&M College, as it was called in those days, and studied electrical engineering and found it exciting to learn how machinery worked, to know that that stuff had a reason for working. And if you knew that, you could do something about it and work on the machinery.
My high school years were filled with work at the local drugstore and with music. A week or two before I turned 15, the local drugstore took a risk and hired me to work in the pharmacy. Besides waiting on customers, I also typed up prescription labels, and of course they would always check each one. Full-time during the summer, I worked there, and most weekends during the school year, I worked there. But music was important to me too. In junior high, I had started playing the clarinet, one that was owned by the school. But a friend of the family came up with some money, helped me buy a cheap, and I do mean cheap, clarinet that worked most of the time, but not particularly very well. And so not long after that, my band director, who was a bassoonist with the Norfolk Symphony, suggested that I learn how to play the bassoon. After all, the school owned one of those. So when I did, I learned how to play, and when I was 16, my junior high band director invited me to play in the Norfolk Symphony. Wow. And my high school band director, who was also a member of the symphony, provided the transportation. Otherwise, I would not have been able to go. I played there during my sophomore and junior years in high school. I graduated in 3 years, so no longer had an instrument to play, and that was the end of that. But what a great experience it was. I went to summer school so I could graduate in that 3 years. And I got a job full-time at the bank thereafter. Still worked at the drugstore on the weekends, but I really wanted to go to college, and fortunately, I got the opportunity. there had been an all-male military academy in our community. It was started by a man named Fred Beasley, who was a generous man who gave lots of money to lots of good causes. But it was all male. And his wife said, you've got to do something for the women. She was a women's libber before it's time to be a women's libber. And so he founded Frederick College, a college for both men and women. And he gave away 50 full-ride scholarships, all the fees, everything. Books, tuition, all fees paid, just everything. It didn't cost me a dime for 4 years of college. I had to make an application for that scholarship. And I have to tell you, my dad was not very happy about that because he had to fill out financial forms. And that was none of their business, he said. And so he didn't want to fill it out. And my mother interceded and convinced him to fill out the papers. I don't know what price she paid for that, but I know he didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. That was tough. But since I had graduated in summer school the year before, I was invited back to witness the graduation of my friends when they graduated. And the school called Mother to tell her that I was going to get one of those 50 scholarships. And she didn't tell me about that. She just took me off to graduation to see that. But she told my daddy, and my daddy didn't want to go. He refused to go. So I went, and surprise, surprise, I won one of those scholarships. Well, college was a great, great experience. It was a brand new college, so we were starting up everything. We started all the organizations that were there. We set all the traditions that were to come. It was just a great thing. I majored in business administration and minored in music. And, of course, the school provided an instrument for me to play. My daddy was the proudest one, though, at graduation. I can never forget how proud he was. While in college, I worked in the summers at the drugstore and full-time there most weekends.
When I graduated from Clemson, I got a job as an electrical engineer at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia. I'd never been that far away from home before. Never seen a ship, had no idea what they looked like on the inside. But it was interesting work, drawing plans and writing procedures to install power and lighting systems on a ship like that. It was fascinating seeing all you had learned in the classroom and in the labs up close and in person, so to speak. And after I'd worked there about 10 years, the shipyard started refueling and overhauling nuclear submarines. And some of us had the chance to get some more training and become nuclear engineers. And fortunately, I was one of those. Then the work really got interesting. There was, of course, greater attention to safety and quality control, given the fact that you had a nuclear reactor plant on board, and the mission of the ship was to remain submerged for months on end. I had the opportunity once to go out to sea on sea trials for 3 days. All the systems that could be tested at dockside had completed testing, and now how all those systems work together could only be tested out at sea. So, sea trials. Now, these submarines were round, almost like a Pepsi bottle. So, going out to sea, they rocked back and forth. They just rolled. But when you got submerged, you wouldn't even know you were moving. So here you are going out for sea trials, but you can't dive, can't submerge until you get out to deep water. So it is hours of rocking back and forth, enough to make anybody seasick.
I'm glad that was not me. I would definitely have been seasick. When I finished college, my dad thought it was time for me to go to work. Well, I had worked 1 year between high school and college, but his idea, and it had been earlier, was that I go to work and I buy a car. I mean, that was the idea. But I wanted to go to graduate school after I finished college. So I did my college years at East Carolina, and there I got an MBA. That was my graduate school. I got an MBA, and upon graduation, I got a contract to teach at a community college in North Carolina. I returned to Tidewater area and taught junior high for about 1 semester. And thank goodness I didn't have to teach any more than that. I loved junior high. It was really great, but I had a principal that was not very great. And at the end of that first semester, surprise, surprise, Frederick College, where I graduated from, called and said they had an unexpected opening. And I was invited to go back and teach there, to be an instructor there, teaching business courses and economics. Well, it was a little strange because when I went back there to teach, there were students in the classrooms that I taught that I'd been to college with. So it was an interesting experience at all.
We met each other on a blind date. A guy I worked with, wife, had gone to school with Kay. And so they planned this thing that we should have a date together. He asked me if I would like to have a date, and I said, sure. And his wife asked Kay. She said, okay. We were both interested, but a little bit cautious, too. And so finally, after several weeks or months in trying to get a time, we had our date all lined up. Our friends were going to take us to Virginia Beach, and we were going to watch a movie. You may remember the movie Hawaii, about missionaries going from the U.S. to Hawaii on these very small, cramped, crowded ships. And it was an interesting movie, though. And then about halfway through, I guess, as these missionary ships approached the coastline and the people on the shore saw them coming, some of the local women ran down the beach to meet the ship, and as they ran, they threw off the upper parts of their garments. And I thought, gee, is this any place to take a woman on a first date?
Well, both of us were interested in going out again, in spite of that. So Don asked me if I'd like to go for an afternoon at the Norfolk Zoo. Had a great zoo there. And to stop on the way and get a submarine sandwich at a local bakery that he knew. So I said, yeah, that sounds like fun. Let's do that. And we stopped at that bakery. It was the dumpiest looking bakery I've ever seen. It had vinyl chairs, and no two are alike. Had an old-fashioned drink box, you know, the one like they had little runners in it, and you'd pull the drink down the runners and lift it up. Well, that's what they had. But I looked over in the pastry case, and it looks great. Well, Don goes up to the counter, and he tells the clerk, I'd like to have 1 submarine sandwich, and cut it in half. And I thought, what kind of cheapskate am I out with? But it was 1 humongous sandwich. We could have eaten twice off that. It was really great. And then we went and enjoyed an afternoon at the zoo. A fun afternoon. Never, ever did we date anybody else. That was it. It was love at first sight. He proposed after a year.
When we got engaged, we knew that down the road we were going to face some difficulty in deciding where it would be that we would live. I own a house, a small house in Portsmouth, but the college where Kay taught, Frederick, required all the faculty to live on campus. Weird idea, maybe. But it was an old Army base, and there were a number of buildings where ammunition had been stored, and these were converted into housing, and Kay lived in one of those. And of course, we knew that it was not anything critical that would keep us from getting married, but we kept putting it off, deciding how we would make that decision. Then one day I went out for lunch in Portsmouth to Shoney's, and while I was there, a group came in. The governor was there and several dignitaries. Well, they looked dignitaries. They were all dressed up, unlike most of us. And I thought, oh, well, I'm going to have something exciting to tell Kay tonight. I could tell her I had lunch with the governor. So when I got to Kay's house last night, all ready to tell her my news, I found she was almost in tears. And, I couldn't figure this out. But I quickly learned why the governor had been in town. He had been in town conversing with Mr. Beasley, the owner of Frederick College, because Mr. Beasley was tired of that and was giving it to the state along with the $1 million so that it would be used as a community college. And of course, the faculty just found out about it that day, and none of them were sure that they would have a place to work next semester. Well, as it turned out, later on they were informed that they would all get jobs at the community college. And Kay, rather than being required to live on campus, would be required to move out of her ammunition dump. Luckily, she had someone willing to take her in.
Certainly was glad of that. Though Don had been a Baptist all his life, and we were both married in the Baptist church, we wanted a smaller church closer to our home. And we found a small, active Presbyterian church with a warm fellowship and had an interest in the local community. We got involved teaching Sunday school, visiting newcomers, organizing vacation Bible school, and then serving on the governing board, which is the session of the Presbyterian Church. And a little later, we served at the presbytery level. The presbytery is a geographic gathering of churches of that denomination. So we worked with them, and we worked particularly with a small church task force. And leading congregational goal setting in several churches. Don and I went around and did that. So that was a fun thing to do. We enjoyed that. Before long, we each individually began to feel the call to small church ministry. We can't remember how the conversation started, but on a Sunday afternoon, we can't remember who said it first, but we said, you know what I've been thinking about? I think God is calling me to be a minister in a small church. Well, after much prayerful consideration, lots of conversation with each other, we decided it was time to ask others if they saw that in us, and they did.
We both had really good jobs. We're set in our careers, or so we thought. We just built a great, large house, 11 rooms on a tidal creek that emptied into the Nansemond River, that emptied into the Chesapeake Bay. Wonderful place to live. Who would want to leave a place like that? Well, this sense of call to the ministry had a way of hanging on and nagging you and pushing you on forward. So we decided that we would apply to Union Seminary here in Richmond, and if we got accepted, good, that would be God's will. And if we did not get accepted, well, maybe that was God's will too. Well, we got accepted. It was April 1979. We put our house on the market. You may remember it was a time of high interest rates. I think they were 16%. Well, the thing was advertised, we got no bites, none at all. People just were not buying. Classes were to start in September. And in July, a family came along with cash in hand, ready to buy that house, and they wanted it in 3 weeks. So which means we had to get out. So we found a place to store our furniture, and then the three of us moved in with Kay's parents. You remember that 4-room house?
Well, that was Don and me and our daughter Carol, who at the time was 5 years old. So it was quite a move for us and quite cramped. 1 bathroom, and it was a tiny bathroom, and the 5 of us. Well, we started seminary in 1980, and during seminary we served summer church, a 4-church field in Amelia County, not far from here. And they had a pastor who was installed, who preached at 2 churches on Sunday, and we would preach at the other 2. And then the next Sunday, we changed churches. So we got to see 4 small churches over the course of the summer. One of the things we did there was run a movie theater on Friday nights, I think it was, for the area kids. And so the local merchants would rent movies, Walt Disney movies, and we would demonstrate them and do a little children's sermon. It was a lot of fun. Well, following seminary in 1983, our first call was to churches in Charlotte County, Virginia. There was a 2-church field there, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. But there was 1/4 of the church, one church, and 1/3 of the other church voted not to call us. Well, usually if you had that many people vote no, you say no, thank you. But the search committee and the presbytery and we all felt it was a good match. And so we thought, okay, we'll give it a try. And it was a new thing to have a woman pastor. You know, when we were in Amelia, one of the churches we preached at, if I were to preach, there was one woman just wouldn't come because it wasn't right for a woman to be in the pulpit. So it was a new thing. And it was really a new thing to call a clergy couple. And so it was a hard thing to decide. But it must have been a good match because we ended up staying there 13 years and had a great ministry there. Lots of fun. We were involved in developing the literacy program for Charlotte County. We worked with social services in a number of programs they had. We did just all kinds of things with the community. With high school students, Don worked with them. On several occasions we went in and did things at the high school when they were having difficulties, when a student had problems. We did grief counseling, that sort of thing. So it was an experience. And while we were there, we also worked on our Doctor of Ministry and received that from McCormick Seminary. And also we were part-time coordinators for the new pastor startup. So when a new pastor would come into our presbytery, we were the ones that would go out and meet them, greet them, introduce them to the community, talk to them about what it meant to be a pastor in a church, because we were first-time pastors.
I got to tell you a funny story about showing movies at that church in our summer internship. It was in Amelia County, nothing for kids to do. So our pastor got this great idea about showing the movies. And he ordered these things from somewhere. They came every week in the mail, 2 big reels, and they borrowed 2 projectors from the school system. And it worked great. You know, you show the first one, and then somehow or another you decide that it's about to run out, and you start the second reel. Well, one day we're sitting there, and I heard this terrible noise and looked around, and the take-up reel on this thing was bouncing across the floor. I knew we were in big trouble if I didn't get that thing shut down. But I shut it off, refixed it, and we got it on the ground. But kids thought it was funny. When we left the 2 churches we served in Charlotte County, we came to Colonial Heights, to the Presbyterian church there, and were co-pastors in that one church. I was there 10 years before I retired, and then Kay retired after 12 years. During that time and thereafter for about 16 years, we served as Presbytery coordinators of the Small Church Summer Intern Program. Over the years, we matched and supervised some 70 students as they got their first taste of being a pastor in a small church. About every congregation that we served were older congregations or congregations of older people. We didn't do a wedding until we had been in pastorate for 6 years, and then had to call the neighboring pastors, say, how do you do this? You know, how do you get started? But we did a lot of funerals, as you can imagine. It was, doing funerals was a particularly special part of our ministry. Sitting with families in a time of grief, listening to their stories, encouraging them to tell stories about the person who had died, stories of faith about the family, stories of how they grew together, celebrating life and celebrating faith. And one example of that, there was a Jones family, and let's see, Mrs. Jones died first. And so it's time to get the family together. This was a military family. They had 2 children earlier in their years and 2 other children in later years. Those first children were in high school or college by the time the second children came along. So as we sat and told stories, listened to stories, it was interesting to hear the 2 older children say, we didn't know that. Or to hear the 2 younger children say, we didn't know that. So it was a time of real learning about each other, learning each other's stories. And many years later, we saw the children again, and they thanked us for being there with them to help them remember and tell their stories to each other.
We had a hard time staying retired. 1 year after Don retired, he started serving a small church in Dinwiddie County, and he was there for 7 years. And this was a part-time job, preaching, teaching Sunday school, and being on call for pastoral needs. There, he baptized more children than we baptized in all of our ministry. It's amazing. This church had a reputation for reaching out to kids. And so at vacation Bible school time, they came out of the woodwork all over the place. And they also did for other programs during the year. After my retirement, I rested a year and then began serving a small church also in Amelia County part-time. I was there a year and then had an opportunity to make a move. Don and I went in opposite directions on Sunday mornings. He went one way and I went another. So we decided it would be nice if I took a job at Brunswick County in a little church down there. On Sunday morning, I would drop Don off at his place, and then I'd travel 20 minutes more to my church. And we did that for a number of years. I served there 5 years until I retired again. In addition, both of us continued our work with a small church intern program in our students. Until this past year, we served on the small church committee of our presbytery. But now we really retired, aren't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
As a side note about those churches down in Dinwiddie and Brunswick County, you'll remember Tom Waltz. Tom served both of those churches for a while, and when it got time that he wanted to work a little less, he continued with the Brunswick church, but not the Dinwiddie church. And so I took over at the Dinwiddie church following him. And then later on, he retired completely, and then Kay got the opportunity for the church in Brunswick County that he had served. So it was interesting to follow him and share with him, his view of the ministry and our view. Our daughter, Carol, who entered first grade when we started seminary, got her early education in Charlotte County, Virginia, where she developed interests in art and dance and band. And the school was good at providing these, but not so good in the sciences and in math. So she was a little anxious when she started applying for colleges, wondering what they would think about a small high school in rural Southside Virginia. But she was very pleased to get accepted at Davidson. Her math professor that first year was from Charlotte County. His mother happened to be a member of one of the churches we served. And we discovered that he had graduated from Carroll's high school, Randolph Henry, 50 years before Carroll, and had gone to Davidson. And he was the first to go from there to Davidson, and Carroll was the second. And I think maybe there has not been a third. After graduating from Davidson, Carroll worked on Capitol Hill as a legislative assistant in the office of Virginia Congressman, was there about 7 years. And she married a man that she met at summer church camp, whose father was also a Presbyterian minister. And they too, Carol and her husband, felt the call to ministry and enrolled in seminary in Richmond. She is now vice president of programs for one of the Presbyterian National Conference Centers, Montreat Conference Center, and he is an associate pastor at the Trinity Presbyterian Church in Hendersonville, North Carolina. They have two sons, Olin in the 6th grade and Dean in the 5th grade.
We came to Covenant Woods in 2017. 2017. I got it right now. 2017, and we went and visited lots of retirement communities. We fell in love with this place because it was very casual. As you can tell as I'm sitting here in my casual clothes, which I wear all the time. And we just loved the way we were greeted, and we felt very at home for the first time we came. And since we've been here, before COVID came to our way, we served communion in the healthcare center, which we enjoyed doing. Don now is on the resident council and chairs the facilities committee. And we're both pen pals to students at the Mechanicsville Elementary School here, and we really enjoy that. We get letters from them once a month, and we write once a month, and it's been a lot of fun doing that. We just love this place. We love the people, love the food. It's been hard. We've really quarantined ourselves since COVID came. Today is probably the first time we've really been out eating. We usually take our stuff back to our room, but we now feel safe to do that, and so it's been wonderful. We appreciate this place, and we appreciate this opportunity. It's been fun for us to go back and think through all this. Very nice. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, another aside. Linda knows Charlotte County, Virginia.
One reason I turned my mic off was that I knew that I would want to interject things. You all know me. I talk too much. But so many of the things that they shared, but after they moved here and I had the chance to have lunch with them one day, they said something about Charlotte County, and I said, do you know where Keysville is? Do you know where Drake's Branch is? Do you know where Ontario? Randolph Henry High School? And so I had a connection family-wise in Charlotte County. I want to thank you all for sharing your life story.
Thank you.
I hope you all have enjoyed it as much as I have. The chicken story brought up something from my childhood, and so it was really, really interesting.
Let me tell one more story. You got
Quickly.
Time? I'll do it quickly. We also had goats, I mentioned, and we lived in the county, and then we got annexed by the city, and so we had to get rid of our goat. And so we had a friend that lived out in the country, so we gave the goat to this person to take care of. And they said, you can come visit it anytime you want to. And so I did a few times, And then went to visit one day, and the goat wasn't there, and they said, "Oh, Judy got out, and we don't know where, you know. We looked for it, couldn't find it." I found out years later that I ate Judy.
Oh, gosh.
So never quite forgave my parents for that.
I understand. We had ducks and the same thing happened. I do want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I want to thank the Steele so much for such a interesting life story. And I hope that in 2 weeks that you all will join us again. That'll be on Wednesday, March 10th. We're not going to tell you who the next persons are. So just tune in and see. Good night, and you all have a good evening.